What if Haircut 100 were a Twin Cities punk band? That's the unlikely scenario we'll be looking at on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hi, my name's Morgan Brown and every Monday I upload a new What If videos on my YouTube channel. The idea of these videos is that each week I pick a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I happen to have to hand in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was Fantastic Day by Haircut 100. I tried to reimagine that as a Twin Cities punk rock song, kind of in the manner of Hüskers-style. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. So this week's video, it's another viewer request. It was requested fairly recently. I must admit, I actually moved it up the running order because I had another viewer request that I was working on and that just came out really poorly. And normally these things, I just kind of put them out however they come out, but this one kind of sucked so bad that I didn't want to put it out. So maybe I'll do a special video just explaining what that was, what went wrong, and give you a little taster to explain exactly what was wrong with that. But in the meantime, we moved this one up and it was suggested by Acro Dave, who's one of my regular viewers. So thanks a lot for that, Dave. Really appreciate it. Now, Haircut 100, when I first remember seeing them, I must confess my initial thought was just, who are these nerds? And that's coming from me. They just had this incredibly clean-cut, square, preppy image. But once I got past that, I actually started to listen to the songs, couldn't deny that those are some great pop songs that they had. They only had a pretty brief run initially, but they did do some pretty good stuff during that short time. They were formed in 1980 by Nick Hayward and Les Neames. Nick Hayward, the lead singer, and played some guitar, and Les Neames was the bassist. And they're kind of coming out of the post-punk scene, but they're one of a little wave of bands who've emerged around that same time in the early 80s who, although they clearly had some kind of post-punk roots, they seem to very deliberately move away from the aggression and the scrappiness of punk and post-punk, whilst also moving away from the posturing and cliches of rock as well. So there's a little wave of guitar bands around the same time who obviously wanted to play guitar music but didn't want to be tied to that kind of baggage that came with the guitar rock of the 70s and the 60s. I'm going to talk a bit more about this next week actually, because it's going to end up being relevant there too. But Haircut 100, obviously, as I'm talking about, but I think I always kind of consider them to be part of a wave of bands alongside the likes of, I guess, Aztec Camera, Orange Juice to some extent, the Bluebells, bands like that who really were making quite polished pop music, still guitar based, but not in any way really connected to any of the kind of blues rock stuff that was the main preserve of guitar players for so many years previously. So they're just drawing on a bunch of different influences, which makes that kind of music really quite refreshing and interesting in that time period. So both in Haircut 100 and those other bands I mentioned, you can definitely hear sort of bits of older guitar pop. There's some kind of 60s pop in there, but at the same time there's jazz influences, there's a hefty dose of funk in there, there's loads of guitars, but instead of blasting out power chords or playing kind of traditional rock solos or whatever, they're generally jangling away in some really interesting way, using different chord voicings to what we've been hearing in rock music. So it's a pretty interesting time. I mean, it's hard to pinpoint some of these post-punk genres that spring up in the early 80s because there's a lot of different things going on that all kind of overlap. So your new romantics and new pop, post-punk, synth pop, jangle pop, indie pop, all these different labels that people are throwing around, and there's so much overlapping between them. But As I say, I think you can identify Haircut 100 as being sort of part of this little wave of these bands who were just trying to do something different with the idea of playing in a pop band with guitars. And it worked really well. That first album, Pelican West, was a big success. A few massive hit singles off that. Love Plus One, which I think is the first thing I ever heard by them. Then Fantastic Day, that we've done this week, just a tremendous song. Favourite Shirts as well, the other hit single from that album, dives a lot more into the funk side of what they were doing. And you can see parallels in that to both what Orange Juice were doing from more of a post-punk indie perspective, but also early Spandau Ballet were in some respects doing similar things from the sort of new romantic angle. So they did just kind of fit there in between these different scenes that were going on. The future looked very bright for them indeed, but unfortunately it was pretty short-lived, and as they were trying to work on that second album, Nick Haywood decides to leave the band. Had some ambition, I think, for a solo career, but also I think he was getting quite anxious with the whole limelight of fronting the band. I think there's a lot of internal tension as well over songwriting, and it was just an unfortunate situation. So right in their prime, they lose their lead singer and main songwriter, which, you know, would kill off most bands, but they did actually soldier on and made a second album. And Mark Fox, who's the percussionist who also sang backing vocals on that first record, just moves centre stage, takes over the lead vocals. And it's surprisingly good, considering that they'd just lost their kind of leading light. From what I've heard, certainly doesn't sound like any kind of particular step down from the first record, but it kind of feels like maybe people had already written them off by the time that came out. I don't think there was a great deal of label support. There wasn't a great deal of radio support. So the first single from the album just scrapes into the very lower reaches of the charts. And then the second one didn't chart at all, which is a real shame, because actually So Tired, that second single, is my favourite song I've ever heard by Haircut 100. It's just a fantastic, brooding little bit of pop. Really reminds me of the kind of thing that Squeeze were doing around the same time. Excellent bit of pop songwriting, but sadly it was not to be a hit, and that did actually finish off the band for a long time. But they're back. I think they were initially brought back together by VH1's Bands Reunited, which is, if you've not seen it, absolutely great show. I think all the episodes are up on YouTube now, and it's really, really fun. But then they've periodically got back together, and I think they seem to be a pretty permanent unit again now, which is really nice to see, because, as I say, I think they were a proper breath of fresh air in the British pop scene at the time, and it's nice to see them back together. And I think they even had a new single out, like the first new thing they'd done in 40 years last year, so it's kind of cool. I like to see that. So while Haircut 100 were part of a wave of bands who were revitalising guitar music in the UK, at the very same time over in the States, and more specifically in the Twin Cities, there was another wave of guitar bands who were kind of doing the same thing for guitar music over in the States in a way. It's funny because just a couple of months ago I did my Larry Williams Minneapolis funk track, so I was talking about that Minneapolis sound that grew up around Prince and the Revolution and Morris Day and the Time, and I did mention in that video that it was pretty remarkable that in one city, and even largely focused around one building, that being First Avenue, there were two separate but parallel scenes that were both massively influential that were happening around that time in the early 80s. So if you look back at the gig listings in First Avenue in those days, you see that the main venue being dominated by all these great funk bands, but then there's a smaller stage within the same building, 7th Street Entry, and if you look at the listings for that, you can see this punk and new wave scene happening at the same time. And it's interesting the way punk sort of spread in the US, because every Midwestern town that has a scene has its own sort of variant, relatively uninformed by the outside world in a way. And a lot of these places don't really get to see punk bands from anywhere else until Black Flag were really the pioneers who, through sheer determination, established this kind of DIY touring network throughout the States. So they join the dots between all these little regional scenes and go out and play in these places, and then what happens is that all these regional variants of punk rock collide with this West Coast hardcore powerhouse, and that creates a fusion that then sparks a bunch of different, quite contrasting regional hardcore scenes all across the US. And I'll probably look at some of those other scenes, but the Minneapolis one is probably my favourite out of all those different Midwest scenes. I mean, Hüskers-style have long been probably my favourite band of all time, with the Replacements not too far behind. So in Minneapolis, around the turn of the 80s, you've got a small but really quite diverse scene going on. Some of the early Minneapolis bands, you've got the Suicide Commandos, who were great and really influential, special for such an obscure band, both in terms of their sound and in terms of the fact that their guitarist actually taught a bunch of other people in the scene to play, including Bob Mould of Hüskers-style. But yeah, they had a great punky kind of power pop sound, which you can really hear reflected in what some of the more widely known bands were doing just a couple of years later. But at the same time, you've also got cowpunk bands, there's really arty new wave bands, there's all kinds of stuff going on. And if you listen to the Savage Young Do box set of rough as hell live recordings and demos of early Hüskers-style, you can hear all these different influences being reflected in the music of this developing band, where they kind of start out as just a kind of straight ahead garagey punk band. They introduce more power pop, but then they get on an art rock kick and start doing this stuff that's a lot more angular and dissonant. And then you can hear the point where Black Flag comes through town, and then all of these influences get mashed together and sped up and put through a blender. So I think in a way the sound that you hear Hüskers-style making on records like Metal Circus and New Day Rising and Zen Arcade is kind of almost a synthesis of all these different elements of that Minneapolis scene combined with the fury of that West Coast hardcore sound. And it's a wondrous thing. The other real leading lights of that scene, the Replacements, while you can definitely hear bits of what else was going on in the Minneapolis scene in what they were doing, they're kind of a little bit more their own thing, a little bit more rooted in rock and roll tradition. Although they certainly, at least initially, were very much a punk band, a lot of what they did kind of goes a bit more back to rootsy bar band rock. And even at their most furious, they've probably got as much in common with Bruce Springsteen or Tom Petty as they have with Black Flag at any given time. But which is not to say they didn't make some absolutely storming punk records. I mean, certainly those first two records, Sorry Ma Forgot to Take Out the Trash and Stink, absolutely raging punk. But then you find them just broadening out, diversifying their sound, keeping that energy and drive, but introducing some softer elements, a bit of heartland rock, a bit of folksy jangle. And while that was happening, obviously Hüskers-style were going through a similar process, just keeping the intensity but slowing down a little bit, allowing the melody that's always been slightly buried under this wall of noise to come through a little bit more. And there's a ton of other great stuff developing in that city at the same time. Rifle Sport and Loud Fast Rules, who became Soul Asylum and who would achieve great success a little bit later on. But initially it's those two bands who really kind of capture critical attention and as a result come a bit more into the national spotlight. And eventually both bands get signed to major label deals, which is a pretty unusual thing for a punk rock band in the States at the time. And as it turned out, sort of mainstream success wasn't on the cards for either of those bands. But I think the move to at least try and introduce the Replacements and Hüskers-style into the mainstream acted as a bit of a dry run for what happened later on with Nirvana. I think the increased exposure that those bands got at that time definitely turned on a whole generation of musicians to the idea that punk rock didn't have to just be furious, minute-long anti-government rants. You could have that fury and intensity and energy, but it could be personal, it could say something with emotional depth, and it could be melodic. So much of that wave of 90s alternative and any kind of indie guitar rock to this day owes a colossal debt to those two bands specifically, but also just to that whole Minneapolis punk scene. But anyway, that brings me to this week's Alternative Universe scenario. So in my alternative timeline this week, it's 1981. We've got a Young Haircut 100. They've been going for a little while. They're not signed yet. They're still living in the UK, but they've heard these records that are coming out of Minneapolis by Prince and Morris Day and The Time, and they're so excited by this new funk scene that's up and coming, and they're really interested in funk music, so that's something that they want to pursue. So eventually they think, if we want to make this kind of music, we really need to be where the action is. So they make the momentous decision to up sticks and move wholesale from Beckenham all the way over across the Atlantic to Minneapolis and St. Paul. So move over there, get settled in. Immediately the first thing they want to do is get themselves a gig at First Avenue. They think they're just going to waltz in there and immediately be supporting Prince and the Revolution. As it turns out, not that easy to get on one of those bills. So they're trying to get a gig, and instead of getting on the bill at First Avenue, they find themselves playing at 7th Street Entry, the smaller stage in the same building, and think, well, you know, it's a start. The very first bill they find themselves on is with the Suicide Commandos and Hüskers-style and the Replacements, and the moment that the gig begins, they're just absolutely blown away by this incredible wall of melodic noise that they're faced with. In that moment, any thought of playing funk or R&B is just totally tossed out the window. They realise, oh, this is the kind of music we need to be playing. So they overhaul their songs, stripping away all the jazz and funk elements, keeping the melody but overlaying it with this wall of energetic noise, and start gigging on the punk rock circuit in earnest. And they do that for a few years and it goes pretty well, but after a while the grueling Minneapolis winters get a bit too much for them and they concede defeat and head back home. But in the meantime, they've recorded a little string of albums for the Twin Tone label there in Minneapolis, and these go on to be massively influential and cited as a major inspiration for so many bands of the 90s alternative rock revolution. So their journey over to the States was not in vain. So, I was very happy when Dave suggested trying to turn this track into a Hüsker-style song, because the moment he suggested it, I could immediately hear it as specifically a Grant Hart Hüskers song. If you don't know, Hüsker-style had two principal songwriters, Grant Hart and Bob Mould. Both had quite distinct styles, and this is definitely a Grant song. It's got that kind of extremely poppy melody, the talking section as well, the little breakdown bit could be straight out of a Grant song, so that's the sound I was aiming for. As ever, my first step is just taking the isolated vocal, dropping it into GarageBand and getting it synced up. Once I'd done that, I sped it up quite a lot because obviously punk rock, we want loads of energy, so cranked up the tempo a fair bit. Next step, I programmed in some drums. Because I was mainly focusing on that Hüsker-style sound, I tried my very best to create a really Grant Hart sounding drum part. So simple and driving, rattling snare fills, loads of washy ride cymbal, no hi-hats. He very rarely plays on the hi-hats at all. Added some bass, again, in keeping with the Hüskers thing, trying to go for a bit of a Greg Norton feel. One thing you don't get so much with Greg is the driving eighth notes. He doesn't play like a D.D. Ramone. It tends to be slightly sparser, but this really growly, almost honky kind of mid-rangey tone, and quite often played relatively high up, so he's almost in the same range as the guitars, just contributing to that kind of solid wall of noise that they created. So that's what I tried to go for. And then guitar-wise, if you listen to something like Celebrated Summer from New Day Rising, which is one of my favourite records of all time, one of the things I've always loved about that is the way just new layers of guitar keep piling on, so I decided to layer up a bit like that. The Bob Mould sound, the signature sound that he always had, it's an MXR Distortion Plus distortion pedal and an AHX small clone pedal into a clean amp, so that lots of distortion coming from this old school 70s hard clipping pedal. I generally do all the guitar sounds just using built-in effects and amp sims from in GarageBand, so they don't have one that's exactly like a Distortion Plus, but I did a pair of rhythm guitars first, using the old school distortion effects that they have in there. So there's one that's meant to be a Boss DS1 and one that's meant to be a Rat. So not exactly like the MXR pedal, but still that kind of 70s hard clipping sound, both with a bit of chorus on as well. And they're just kind of bashing out the chords. In the breakdown section with the talking bit, I wanted a slightly softer sound because there's only so much you can ease off on these really fizzy distortion sounds. So I had a slightly cleaner tone there with lots more chorus on, playing that little riff that comes in that section for a bit of a contrast. And then one of the things that I really like on some of those old Hüskers records, particularly the ones that were produced by Spot, you can hear on some of those records that he liked to get guitarists to play straight into the desk through effects pedals. Conventional wisdom says that you should never do that because it sounds horrible, and it kind of does. You get this really fizzy, direct sound, no kind of natural ambience, and it sounds really gnarly and unpleasant on its own, but blended in, it just creates loads of really interesting harmonics. So I wanted to try some of that. So I've got a third rhythm guitar that comes in, and that's played through on my regular pedal board that I use for playing in my own band. I do have a Distortion Plus and a small clone, so played straight through those straight into the computer, which sounds absolutely gnarly. So that crops up in a few places too. And then as a final touch, also wanted to have some leads. There's a guitar solo in the original record, so I wanted to do something there. And then also a bit more string mangling over the outro as well. So again, that's going straight through the small clone pedal into the computer, but then into an amp sim, just for another different sound. And a lot of these sounds are pretty ugly on their own, but when you mix them all together, they do make a pretty powerful, just sort of solid wall of noise, which is exactly what I wanted. And then video-wise, as ever, started by just finding a video of a live performance of Haircut 100 doing the song back in 1982. Obviously, they're all just sort of strumming away on acoustic guitars, which didn't seem very fitting for the backing, so I tried to avoid showing too much of that, and instead I intercut some bits of some classic Minneapolis musicians to replace that instrumentation. So I've used bits of both Hüskers and the replacements there. So I've got Paul Westerberg and Bob Stinson's guitars, and Grant Harton and Greg Norton as the rhythm section. So a bit of a Minneapolis supergroup backing them up. And then, as usual for a final touch, I also just mocked up some concert posters just to place Haircut 100 on some kind of classic punk rock bills, featuring some of those Minneapolis luminaries, just to suggest that they were an active part of that scene as well. So I hope you enjoyed this one. I mean, it was an absolute joy for me because I've loved that Husker-Du sound since I first heard the New Day Rising album when I was 14, and it's been a constant obsession of mine. So getting to try and recreate that was great fun. I also really enjoyed just listening to a bit more Haircut 100 because they're not a band I've ever paid that much attention to, but there's actually a bit more good stuff there than I ever realised. So that was really good fun too. If you did enjoy it, please let me know down in the comments. And also, if you could like and subscribe, that really helps. I always appreciate your support. If there's anything you'd like me to do in coming weeks and months, any songs or artists or genres you'd like me to get involved with, do let me know as well. I appreciate your suggestions, even if sometimes things go awry. But otherwise, that's all from me for this week. So thanks very much indeed for watching, and I hope to see you next time.